Inside of today's video, we're going to be ranking all 69 brawlers in the game right now, all the way from the F tier, all the way up until the S tier. So you want to stick around till the end to see who the best brawlers in the game are. So we're going to be starting off with one of the worst brawlers in the game, in Hank. So Hank recently has received a lot of nerfs. When he first came into the game, he was actually one of the most broken brawlers that's ever existed because there's a lot of bugs. But because he was nerfed a lot and all the bugs got fixed, he's actually worked his way to one of the worst brawlers in the game. Especially the fact that he can't heal up whilst charging your bubble, I feel like really hurt him in the meta. So next up is probably the second worst brawler in the game right now. We have Jackie. So Jackie's just been slowly creeping down in the meta. The lack of range and the lack of maps right now really hurt her. She's only really pushable in Brawl, and especially now because in overtime the unbreakable walls actually break up. I feel like she's actually one of the worst brawlers in the game. So next up in the F tier we have Frank. So Frank right now, especially because there's just so many tank counters out there, specifically Shelly, he really does suck in this meta. There's probably a few use cases for him, but overall just so many brawlers cancel out his super. Gale is next up in the F tier. You guys know how bad Gale is recently, especially because he used to be one of the better brawlers in the game, and then they absolutely killed him with nerfs. There's just so many other tank counters out there. It takes him so long to get his super. He's basically never seen in competitive. Next up in the F tier we have Balls. So again, another brawler which is a tank, and he just really does suck in this meta. It takes him so long to charge up his super. He really lacks the range, and even in Heist, I feel like right now there's just so many brawlers that can just take him down so quickly. He really has no need in this meta. And finally in the F tier we have Mortis. So Mortis is still in the F tier for me, even with the recent buffs to his damage and his gadget. I feel like this meta just really doesn't suit him. Maybe if brawlers like Shelly get nerfed, he might creep up a little bit, but for now, he remains in the F tier. So now moving on to the D tier. So these are going to be brawlers which you've probably seen a couple of times in competitive. On the rare occasion, they might have their kind of niche pick. So first one, starting with Byron. So Byron used to be that super versatile brawler picked everywhere, and then, you know, some months ago now, he got killed with his super charge rate, and you just rarely see him anymore. He's too defensive, and the fact that it takes so long to build up your super, you can just take him down so quickly. Next up in the D tier, we have BB. So BB right now, she's okay when it comes down to ladder on some rare occasions, but in competitive, again, there's just so many brawlers that can cancel out BB's just main attack, and it's just really easy to pick on a BB in this meta. Next up in the D tier, we have Roses. So again, another tank which just really suffers within the game right now. You know, a Shelly, for example, is just going to absolutely delete a Rosa. There's probably a few use cases for her, you know, like in Sneaker Fields, for example, but more often than not, she gets outranged by so many brawlers. Next up in the D tier, we have Mandy. So Mandy really hasn't had a place in the meta since her release. You know, she's pretty okay in bounty and knockout, like she's pushable on most game modes, but more often than not in competitive she's too risky to play because her super is actually incredibly hard to hit, especially because now people are aware that it's so easy to dodge. So for me, Mandy definitely is one of the worst brawlers in the game. Next up in the D tier, we have Buster. So Buster's a pretty underrated brawler within the game. He's got his few use cases on a few specific maps like Pinhole Punt and Double Swoosh, but more often than not, Buster just really lacks the damage, and once his gadgets run out, he's so easy to take down. Next up in the D tier, we have Edgar. So Edgar finally isn't one of the worst brawlers in the game right now. He actually has a lot of use cases. I think secretly his HP buff actually a lot more than people realized, and he's actually seen not really often in competitive, but more often than a lot of the brawlers, you know, kind of around him in a D tier. He's actually used quite a fair amount in Heist as a last pick, and especially on maps with a lot of unbreakable walls like Field Goal, for example. You see Edgar is actually one of the best last picks there. Next up in the D tier, we have Colt. So since unbreakable walls, of course, he's just diminished within the meta. There's only really a few scenarios where he's actually decent in, you know, for example, like Safe Zone. He's good at getting damage onto the high safe, but competitively speaking, he's just too risky to use. And lastly in the D tier, we have Chester. So Chester's a little bit underrated in my opinion, but in competitive he has zero use. Nobody uses him, but I think on the grassy maps he can have a little bit of usage, but most of the time the reason why he's not picked is because there's so many top tier brawlers that can counter him easily, like Crow, for example. Until some of them more meta brawlers get nerfed, you won't really see a Chester meta. So now we're moving on to the C tier. So these are typically brawlers that are probably used more often than not in like one particular game mode, or they have like a good counter pick niche. So starting off with Rico in the C tier. So Rico, I really wasn't liking Rico in the previous meta, but with the recent buff to his multi-ball launcher, I feel like he actually has a use in the meta. He's actually pretty good on maps like Pit Stop because that gadget can get up to 20% on the safe if left alone. It's really underrated and a good way to defend himself. So Rico slowly creeping up a little bit, but still other brawlers outshine him. So next up in the C tier, we have Nani. So Nani, of course, is only really strong on Bounty and Knockout, where maps like Shooting Star are going to be her best map. But then you got to realize as well, a lot of her best maps have been removed. So she's really map dependent. Of course, she wants it as open as possible. She can be used sometimes in Knockout as well to counter other long-range brawlers, but more often than not, her only use case is in Shooting Star. So next up in this C tier, we have a Piper. So Piper has been drifting down the meta. There's just better kind of sharpshooters out there, and especially since like Shelly's in the meta, she's basically a sharpshooter but with 5k HP. So you can just see there's a lot of other brawlers that have so much more versatility than Piper. She can just get so overwhelmed. Again, I think just like Nani, the only really use case for her are maps like Shooting Star. Other than that, she's just too hard to play right now. So next up in the C tier, we have Sandy. So Sandy, I thought was going to be a little bit more meta because Tara got a buff, so he's a decent counter to Tara. But in the C tier, it's pretty fair because you rarely see Sandy in competitors. The main reason being is because good players can keep their distance from a Sandy. You can pinch Sandy, he has no range. You know, there's a few use cases like on really grassy maps or maps like Crystal Arcade, for example, but still, it takes so long to get a Sandy super. He's just not worth it most of the time. Next up in the C tier, we have Jessie. So Jessie has started to come in a little bit more meta, specifically in Hot Zone, you know, maps like Parallel Plays, and also Dueling Beetles. She has somewhat of a good kind of last pick counterplay because of her turret and her slow. She's also pretty underrated in the highest meta. See her sometimes drafted towards the end, but again, more often than not, she's often outranged, and if you can keep your distance from Jessie, she's really easy to dodge with her main attack. So next up in this C tier, we have Meg. So Meg used to be like the best brawler in the game, and the several nerfs to her have really made her such a mediocre brawler right now. I feel like there's just so many counters to her, and more often than not, you can just overwhelm her so easily. And because now in her small form as well, she's even squishier, she's even easier to take down. So for me, Meg has really fallen off. Next up in the C tier, we have Lou. So of course, Lou is fantastic in Hot Zone. Outside of Hot Zone, he rarely has his use cases. It might be used towards the end of the draft to counter maybe like 2 or more tanks, or specifically brawlers like Sam to try and shut him down. But again, that's very rare that you see him outside of Hot Zone. So next up in the C tier, we have Janet. So recently, she got absolutely killed with those balance changes. She's always been an S tier brawler, but now I think she's easily a C tier brawler because she's so easy to take down. She doesn't really charge her super quick enough, and also she's pretty squishy, so of course she's easy to take down. She does have the rare use case maybe in like Gem Grab. She'll be quite flexible, but more often than not, she's so easy to overwhelm now. Next up in the C tier, we have Fang. So Fang in the right setting can absolutely pop off, but more often than not, good players can easily just not feed a Fang because of course his normal shoe attack is really easy to dodge, so it takes him a long time to get that super. And again, still there's so many brawlers that can cancel him out when he does decide to of course super onto you. You know, it's pretty hard to play a Fang, and specifically he's only really good in like Bounty and Knockout, but still there's just better options there. So next up in this C tier, we have Surge. So straight away, you guys might disagree with me on this one, but the data backs it up. He was like picked once in terms of competitive recently. I just feel like Surge gets so easily overwhelmed. Recently, they did nerf his power shield gadget, so you can't just brainlessly press that gadget now. I actually think that gadget is pretty pointless. It's not really the best. It might be okay if you just run into Brawl ladder, but outside of that, I think Surge is so easy to counter right now. All you need to do is keep him in that first form, which is just so simple. Of course, your randoms might not be able to not feed him, but in competitive, he's so easy to pick on. Next up in the C tier, we have Willow. So Willow actually has quite a lot of use case when it comes down to competitive, mainly because other throwers are banned out really often. Now, think of Pit Stop, for example. You have Dynamite and Barley, which are banned, and then Willow can kind of fill that gap where she's, of course, a thrower that can counter a lot of the squishier brawlers, but then she's at least decent on defense, especially with that super. She can at least run the tanks away. And then again, you see on like maps like Field Goal where she kind of replicates that Barley role. Not as good, but at least she has a place in the meta. Next up in the C tier, we have Griff. So it's probably near the bottom of the C tier because honestly, he's so easy to counter right now. But in some scenarios, he actually is a little bit underrated. You know, like Hot Zone, for example. It can get a lot of zonage just because of that star power, and you actually seen him quite a fair bit amount on Dueling Beetles, for example, but there's just so many of the key maps which you used to play him in, have unbreakable walls. So of course that piggy bank and opening it up, it doesn't really suit him right now. So next up in the C tier, we have Leon. So Leon recently received a kind of indirect buff with the vision gear, not being able to scout him out. But I haven't really seen the kind of data to back up him even improving in the meta, really. It was only used a handful of times in competitive, because more often than not, there's just a meta brawler that can counter him. Like Squeak, for example, can destroy his gadget easily, and so can Mr. P. So those two brawlers straight away that kind of counter one of the best things about him. You know, maybe he's a little bit underappreciated. You know, he's decent across the board, but he's only rarely seen maybe on like Shooting Star, for example. Next up in the C tier, we have El Primo. So El Primo is probably at the high C tier, maybe even low B tier. He's a pretty solid brawler right now in the game. He's really solid on maps like Field Goal and really good in Heist. Because of course you can counter the other tanks, and then again you can still counter quite a lot of the tank counters once you get your super. So I really like El Primo right now. He's a good brawler. And lastly, in the C tier, we have Bo. So it's probably near the bottom of the C tier, but there are some use cases for Bo. For example, in double swoosh, he's actually decent mid, and there's some other use cases as well. I feel like he's really underappreciated, but more often than not, it's pretty easy to dodge a Bo and just overwhelm him so quickly. So now we're moving on to the B tier. So these are brawlers that are typically really strong on a couple of game modes and don't have much use case outside of that. So the first one is going to be Sprout. So this isn't in any type of order, by the way, in the B tier, but Sprout, I think he's near enough B tier, maybe even creeping into the A tier, mainly because in Knockout and Bounty, he's so incredibly strong. He's one of the throwers that can absolutely dominate if you don't deal with him appropriately. But outside of that, there's not really much use case for him. Next up in the B tier, we have Lola. So Lola recently received a buff to one of her star powers, which I think is really underrated. Maybe we could see her move to the A tier once people learn that that's actually a decent star power. But anyways, I think she's just decent across the board. She's of course really strong on Heist and also on Hot Zone, and she's got that rare use case in some other game modes as well. She's a really flexible pick and pretty strong. So next up in the B tier, we have Maisie. So straight away, you're probably thinking, well, why have I always put like Maisie in the top 10? I thought she was in and around the top 10 mainly because of ladder, but you know, competitively speaking, I think Maisie is so overrated by a lot of people. Because for me, you know, she's good at unbrawlable, but there's just better brawlers in that kind of mid department that can outrange her. And I feel like good players just know the dash and super combo is coming. Of course, people still need to learn that in terms of randoms to kind of stay away if she's got super, but more often than not, she's pretty easy to dodge as well. And in competitive, she's only used literally once, so pro players don't really value her, and honestly could even be in the C tier. So next up in the B tier, we have Dynamite. So Dynamite is actually one of the most toxic brawlers in the game, in the sense that if you don't have anything kind of sort of aggressive to deal with him on certain maps, he'll just absolutely dominate, especially a good Dynamite. Especially on maps with a lot of unbreakable walls, is that kind of power pick brawler. But of course, it's still a little bit risky, especially if you play him on ladder, because there's just still so many assassins in the game. But for me, in the right hands, he can absolutely pop off. So next up in the B tier, we have Amber. So Amber's pretty consistent across the board, but her best game modes are going to be like Hot Zone. Also seen a little bit in Gem Grab, Double Swoosh in particular, where certain maps can of course influence whether a brawler is strong or not. And Amber absolutely dominates on Double Swoosh, for example, and also just having the combination of the mythic gear and the reload gear is just a really good addition to her overall. I think she's a great brawler right now. So next up in the B tier, we have Max. So Max was heavily nerfed with the last update, 3 nerfs to her in total, and that has definitely pushed her out of the S tier. So in terms of the data, she's still played a lot and banned a lot in competitive, but I think the win rate just isn't there right now. So maybe eventually people stop playing her and picking her, but in some game modes she's still okay, like Gem Grab as a mid. Brawl, she's okay, but she's more of a counter brawler, you know, specifically if the enemy are like starting to pick a lot of sharpshooters, and Max can be pretty good there. So for me, she's starting to decline, but still kind of average. So next up in the B tier, we have Pam. So maybe I'm overrating Pam a little bit, but for me, of course, I really like your mom. But not only that, she's actually got a brand new mythic gear, which I feel like people are definitely underappreciating, specifically in Hot Zone. I think it's such a dangerous gear because the healing on her Pam turret, it can be so toxic for, of course, single shot brawlers or brawlers that don't have a lot of DPS. But she's pretty consistent across the board. You know, she's pretty good in Hot Zone, of course, good in Gem Grab, and she's secretly good in Knockout. I feel like she's definitely underappreciated. So next up in the B tier, we have Daryl. So Daryl is that underrated assassin, which obviously slips through the draft quite a fair amount. but he's a really good option. He counters so many of the tank counters, but not only that, he's just flexible, especially in Heist. He's a really good option as a last pick. People kind of forget about him. You know, he's a decently underrated pick in like Knockout. I've seen him quite often there. You know, Brawl, and even Gem Grab on some maps like Crystal Arcade. I feel like he's definitely underappreciated. He's really strong in the right moment. So next up in the B tier, we have Colette. So in terms of competitively speaking, she actually is rarely picked, but I still think B tier is pretty fair for her because in Heist, she's still a really strong brawler. You know, Kaboom Canyon, safe zone. She can get a lot of damage if the enemy team, of course, feeds you, but you've got to be the right type of player because there's still quite a few meta brawlers that just do her job a little bit better. So outside of Heist, not really the best, but of course, because of how strong she is in that particular game mode, she has to be near the B tier. So next up in the B tier, we have Brock. So Brock is a pretty balanced brawler across the board. He, of course, has his better game modes like Heist, where he can get a lot of damage. And not only that, you know, he's pretty decent on Knockout and Bounty because he's kind of like mini hybrid brawler. He's at least okay against aggro because he can switch to his Rocket Laces gadget. Across the board, he's just decent. Next up in the B tier, we have Buzz. So depending on what type of Buzz player you are, of course, he could be actually one of the best picks in the game, but a couple of bad plays can easily make you completely useless in that game. But for me, Buzz is a fantastic late pick when it comes down to draft. Not only that, he can of course just get a lot of pressure if you find the right kind of brawler, but of course there's still a lot of meta brawlers out there that just destroy him, like Shelly, like Otis for example, but in the right hands definitely capable of some good things. Next up in the B tier, we have Sam. So Sam is pretty underrated within the game right now. I feel like in the right hands he can absolutely pop off, but still some glaringly obvious counters like Otis and Shelly at the top. But if you manage to get yourself onto like a Mr. P or a Squeak, he is a fantastic option. So you see him quite often late on in a draft, you know, in Gem Grab specifically, Brawl pretty good, and even some of the other game modes as well, just because he's a bit more of a riskier pick. Maybe people don't think he's a B tier brawler. Next up in the B tier, we have 8-Bit. So I'd probably put him somewhere towards the bottom of the B tier or the top of the C tier, mainly because brawlers like Squeak and Mr. P have rose to the top of the meta, so they counter his turret a little bit too hard. But if you can avoid those specific brawlers in Heist, for example, or Gem Grab, that's where he tends to pop off the most. He's really good because, of course, especially in Gem Grab, he's that mid brawler which can just be good against everything and not be vulnerable against kind of assassins. That's what you want as a mid in this meta, so he's pretty decent across the board. And lastly, in the B tier, we have Eve. So she's pretty much an A tier brawler, but I feel like her best game modes are Bounty and Knockout. That's where you see her the most. She has the, of course, use case in other game modes as well, like Kaboom Canyon and Heist and Safe Zone as well, where any map with a bit of water, she's a really solid pick, just good against everything. So Eve is a really strong brawler right now. Alright guys, so now we're moving on to the A tier brawlers in the game right now. So these are brawlers which are pretty solid across the board, so you can get away with using them against pretty much everywhere. And if you go into ladder, for example, you know you're going to have a good game pretty much no matter who you're facing off against. So starting off with RT then. So RT is a fantastic option, specifically in Bounty and Knockout, because the best thing about him, of course, he counters either long range brawlers, but then you're not actually too vulnerable against other kind of assassins as well. You know, like Bonnie, for example. Bonnie can't jump onto an RT, so that's why he's a really strong option right now. And he's just decent across the board, but of course, you've got to be wary of brawlers like Mr. P, who counter him quite heavily. Next up in the A tier, we have B. So she's no longer an S tier brawler, but still A tier. She's one of the best in the game quite easily right now. Unfortunately, there's a couple of meta brawlers that really put her kind of down in the A tier, like Mr. P and Squeak, for example, but in the right setting, she can still absolutely pop off. Specifically in Brawl, she's picked quite often there because she's so good against everything. She's decent as a mid in Gem Grab, and she can be definitely usable on really open maps like Open Zone and Hot Zone, where she can dominate in that setting. But in most cases, she's actually outranged by other sharpshooters, so still a decent pick in this meta. So next up in the A tier, we have Spike. So Spike recently received 2 buffs, both to his Fertilizer Star power and also his Popping Pincushion gadget, where in Heist, specifically on base race maps like Pit Stop, he's so dangerous. It's so hard to deal with a Spike in that game mode, so that's why he's pushed up into the A tier. And then of course he's really versatile with his build, because again, if you've got some really hard counters, you can switch it out depending on your matchup. But in Gem Grab and Brawl, he's still really good with Curveball. Across the board, he's a fantastic option right now. Next up in the A tier, we have Tick. So quite easily, some people would put Tick in the S tier just because of how much he dominates in Knockout and Bounty in particular. Maybe there's a few other use cases for him, but in those 2 game modes in particular, if the enemy team has the Tick, they will definitely win pretty much all of the time because he's just so good against everything, so good at pressuring the enemy team back. Of course, you can't just go tick everywhere. Like I see some randoms go ticking like Hot Zone and Brawl, for example. But overall, in Bounty and Knockout, he'll just absolutely hard carry and definitely that power pick brawler. So next up in the A tier, we have Grom. So even with his many nerfs over the months, he's still a really strong brawler, specifically, of course, again, in Bounty and Knockout. But the good thing about Grom in particular, rather than other throwers, is that he's actually got some other uses. You know, in Heist, for example, he's actually a really good late pick on Safe Zone, where he can get so much damage on the same with Pit Stop as well. And, you know, especially on really grassy maps, I think his other gadget is pretty underrated. It gives you a lot of vision and like Infinite Doom, for example. So I think in the right hands, Grom can absolutely pop off. So next up in the A tier, we have Tara. So Tara has finally found her way back into the A tier, recently receiving quite a few buffs in terms of her damage specifically. That has leapfrogged her up into the meta. She's also pretty good counter to top brawlers like Shelly, for example. But not only that, she actually has use cases outside of Brawl and Gem Grab. She's used on Infinite Doom, for example, in Bounty. She's used in Ring of Fire on Hot Zone. So I think that's kind of pushed her into the A tier. Of course, she does so much damage and gets her super much quicker now. Overall, she's a really solid option. So next up in the A tier, we have BRAWLERS. So in terms of what pros think, he could easily be like an S tier brawler for sure. And in terms of competitive, he was like the 8th most picked / banned brawler right now. So just going to show that he's favored on so many different maps. Main reason being, of course, unbreakable walls are really going to favor him. But not only that, he's just decent against everything. He can actually put up a fight against aggressive picks because, of course, of his slowing gadget. But he's actually a really good pick in Bounty and Knockout, where before other throwers used to steal his limelight, but they're more often banned, and then Body can be played, and he's pretty toxic in Knockout specifically. Of course, he's really good in Brawl and sometimes in Gem Grab as well. In the right setting, a Body is so hard to deal with. So next up in the A tier, we have Nita. So just like Tara, she has a few use cases outside of Brawl and Gem Grab, but more specifically because she counters a really strong brawler in Shelly. So of course that's going to bump her up a little bit in the meta, but still she's one of the most drafted brawlers in competitive recently. Just going to show how powerful she can be on Gem Grab and Brawl. Just down the lanes, she's just super consistent, can win pretty much every matchup. And then also, of course, you got her in Heist and Pit Stop, for example, where she's a really strong early pick. In the right hands, Nita can definitely pop off. So next up in the A tier, we have Poco. So he's kind of sneaked his way back into the top of the meta, specifically because he counters quite a few of the top brawlers. But not only that, there's a lot of maps as well that he can really dominate on. Pretty much every Hot Zone map right now really favors him, and he's a really annoying brawler to deal with in that game mode. Of course, Brawl on a lot of grassy maps, he can get so much pressure so early on. And the good thing about Poco right now is that his Protective Tunes gadget is really underrated. It can cancel out so many of the top brawlers' slows, and also the mute effects from Cordelia's, from Otis, for example. I think he's pretty underrated in that category as well, and he's used pretty much in every game mode outside of probably Heist and Knockout. So next up in the A tier, we have Ems. So Ems, again, just like Tara and Nita, she's so fantastic in Brawl and Gem Grab. She's that good hybrid brawler, good against pretty much everything, has good matchups everywhere, so that's where she's going to dominate for the most part. Again, in Heist, in a few maps which have that kind of base race element like Pit Stop, and some other maps like Cover Crowd, where she can definitely dominate in that category. So for me, she's a really strong option right now. So next up in the A tier, we have Ash still. So Ash is still a really strong last pick option. He's only really good right now in Brawl and Gem Grab. You actually don't see him as often maybe as other last pick brawlers, but he's still to be considered. But because there's so many brawlers like Tara, like Ems and Shelly, it's starting to drift down a little, but still a really good option to have. So next up in the A tier, we have Jean. So if you saw my tweet recently, I feel like Jean is actually one of the most overrated brawlers in the sense the meta don't really suit him. It's hard to actually pull people right now. But the reason why he's so strong and so banned so often is because he's such a safe pick in Bounty and Knockout. You can be really slow and defensive and support your teammates really easily, of course, with a magic buff star power. And then you've got the vision gear, which is just so broken on him. The intel that he can give is just second to none, the best by far. So Jean, he's still a really good option, but I feel like it's still frustrating to main Jean right now. Next up in the A tier, we have Gray. So Gray isn't really favored too much by the meta, but still he's still an A tier brawler because in the right hands, it can pop off, but still at the same time, in the wrong hands, he can be pretty down bad. And the fact that still his star power got buffed recently, so he's a bit better in gamers like Bounty and Knockout, or just if you want to be a little bit more aggressive with the teleport. but overall he's just decent across the board. So next up in the 8 tier we have Belle. So Belle is just a pretty consistent brawler across the board, and you can never go wrong with picking a Belle. Really safe option when it comes down to a lot of heist maps like Safe Zone and Kaboom Canyon. She definitely is one of the better brawlers right now. And lastly, in the A tier, we have Penny. So finally, she's not an S tier brawler. Honestly, in terms of the stats, she could be near to the B tier. I don't really see her drafted too much in Power League or in competitive anymore, but she's still a fairly consistent brawler across the board. You just can't pick her like as a first pick everywhere right now, which is a little bit too squishy, and also some of the best brawlers in the meta like Squeak counter her too hard right now. Okay guys, so we're going to be jumping into the S tier now. So these are brawlers which can pretty much go in every single game mode, and in specific game modes they'll just absolutely dominate, really solid across the board. So starting off with the first S tier brawler in Ruffs. So Ruffs, even though some of the top brawlers like Mr. P and Squeak counter him, I feel like he's still a really consistent brawler across the board. When it comes down to Brawl and Gem Grab, he's really solid there, and he's still usable pretty much everywhere except for bounties. So for me, Ruffs definitely is more so of a carry brawler instead of a support brawler in this meta. Next up in the S tier, we have Otis. So normally Otis in draft isn't actually picked too often because of course you've got Shelly and other tank counters out there, but I think mainly in terms of ladder, Otis is still an S tier brawler. He's so good against everything. He's got the range to compete with a lot of different brawlers, and then of course he's got the mute, and he can just be really toxic across the board. So that's why he's still in the S tier. He's just decent everywhere. Like, he can be picked in pretty much every scenario. Next up in the S tier, we have Stu. So Stu, in terms of competitive, was actually like the 7th most picked and banned brawler. So just going to show that pros really like mainly banning Stu, because in the right moment, especially if you have low ping, you can absolutely carry and destroy the enemy team. Specifically in Hot Zone, there's a lot of Hot Zone maps right now which really favor him, with Duel and Beetles and Open Zone and being 2 of them which he dominates on. And of course he's pretty solid everywhere. You can even play him as a gem carrier in this gem grabber meta. So for me, he definitely is an S tier brawler right now. Next up in the S tier, we have Bonnie. So she was the 3rd most picked / banned brawler right now in this meta, just going to show how dominating she is across the board. In terms of heist, she's pretty much the best option everywhere there. In terms of Hot Zone, she can be really good, and she's just a really consistent brawler. Like, of course, she's got the range, and then she's got the super as well to counter so many of her counters, if that makes sense. You know, you think of like, I don't know, Belle, that can be good against her when she's in a normal form. She could just then use her super and destroy them. Same goes with like B, for example. She's just really good at gaining in back pressure on a lot of different circumstances as well. She's a really strong brawler right now. Next up in the S tier, we have the Carl. So Carl is a brawler which people don't actually talk about in terms of how strong he is, but right now in this particular meta, he's so dominant. You can pick him in every single scenario across the board. Normally it was kind of that last pick brawler where you got to be scared about, but right now he's just going to dominate everywhere, mainly because some of the top brawlers like Mr. P and Squeak, Carl just destroys hands down. They can't do anything about. But not only that, I just love Carl because of the pressure he can put out onto the opponents. A good Carl can literally clap anyone. So for me, he definitely is near the top 5 in terms of the best brawlers. Okay, so next up in the S tier, we have Mr. P. So you guys probably know by now, he's probably my most hated brawler. He's so annoying right now, and you probably heard me mention a lot in terms of him countering so many of the other brawlers below him. He is that counter brawler in the fact that his porters just destroy so many of the single shot brawlers, and he's so consistent across every single game mode. Of course, you can't like first pick him anywhere because he still gets countered by those aggressive brawlers, but across the board, he's so versatile, so consistent, and he's so good in this meta. Okay, so now jumping into the top 5 brawlers in the game right now. So it's definitely decisive on this one. Starting off at number 5 with Gus. So Gus right now, you've heard me say it time and time again, he's so incredibly strong. You've got the Cookie Bopper gadget that just tends to carry him a lot of the time. And just the way you play Gus right now, he just collaborates so well with his teammates, being able to just throw that shield onto a lane. They'll end up winning it really easily, and you'll just gain control so incredibly easy right now. Of course, his main attack is really easy to hit as well, and you can pretty much play him in every single scenario. He's like the golden pick when it comes down to bounty and knockout. He's a really good mid in gem grab and Brawl. I think the only game mode he's not great in is heist, but everywhere else he's pretty much the best pick. Okay, so jumping into the 4th best brawler in the game right now, we have Crow. So Crow was actually the 2nd most banned and picked brawler in competitive, just going to show just how toxic he can be, but not only that, just how versatile he is. So if you look at literally every single game mode and scenario outside of bounty and knockout, he's pretty much the best option because you've got the slows, you've got, of course, got a really easy attack to hit. He's got a really toxic star power, and just his main attack, just being able to stop the opponents from healing, is just so vital in this meta in particular. But not only that, even if he does have some counters, you know, for example, like a throw might be able to deal with him because he's squishy, he can then eventually get his super and then just destroy him. His super is just so strong. For me, he's so dominant right now. Okay, so now jumping into the third best brawler in the game right now, might be a big surprise to you guys. It is Squeak. So Squeak was always in and around kind of like the C tier, but recently, due to his star power buff and just how things are kind of shaped around him, he's actually the third best brawler in the game right now. Might seem bizarre, but he was the third most banned brawler in competitive. When it comes down to Power League, I pick him pretty much all of the time, and the thing that makes him so good is just the damage. It's just so good against everything. And even his counters, he can still somewhat, like, at least get him weak, right? Because of how much extra damage he does with that star power. He's pretty much usable on every single scenario. Maybe not on a completely open maps, but pretty much any map with any kind of walkway, that gadget's going to get some insane values. For me, he's easily, and as well as all the pros, they all think he's one of the best brawlers in the game. Alright guys, so jumping into the second best brawler in the game right now, there's no debates about this. It is Shelly. So Shelly, she's easily like the first or second best brawler in the game right now. When it comes down to competitors, I think she was banned or played in pretty much every single set. So just going to show that she's just incredibly broken. She's so good right now. If you're unaware why she's so good, she has a very fast movement speed, which is kind of broken considering she counters tanks so heavily. That very fast movement speed allows her to dodge also those kind of long range brawlers that typically outrange her. She's got the clay pigeons that can just destroy people at range, and then just overall, just the pressure she's able to put out is just second to none. She's so easy to play as well. She's easily one of the best brawlers right now. Alright guys, so now jumping into the best brawler in the game right now, hands down, it is Cordelius. So Cordelius, when he first came out, I knew that he was very strong, but for me, I kind of wait until a lot of people in the game have unlocked him for the Brawl Pass. And then the past few days, a lot of people have unlocked him, and ladder right now is so painful because Cordelius is running over everyone. He hardly has any counters out there. The fact that you can cycle your super so ridiculously and shoot that super through a wall and just destroy everyone in a 1v1 is really toxic. He's got two good gadgets. Not only that, the mute gadget is so toxic. If you can time that correctly, you can pretty much win every single 1v1 matchup. Of course, it does have a few counters, right? Of course, he lacks range. You can't just play him everywhere, but you can make up for that for maybe like your teammates maybe tanking for you. So then you can push up the map and just charge up one super. One super is all you need with Cordelius. Trust me, he's absolutely broken right now. You need to get him if you haven't got the Brawl Pass. So that's the full tier list for all 69 brawlers on the left hand side. You can screenshot that, but make sure to credit me if you put it on any social media platform. I think this is pretty good based off ladder, based off Power League, and also competitive data as well. Let me know whether I've made any big mess ups in the comment section below, and let me know who you think is the best brawler in the game.